Hey guys, welcome back to American Government class. It is Monday, October 19th, 2020, and we are going to get back into the swing of things. Last class, I gave you a current event to do on the presidential debate. Most of us did a great job with that. Congratulations. We are going through a period of time right now where it's actually pretty cool. We get to learn about government while a very important phase of our government is going on, and that is, of course, the presidential elections, the Senate elections, and the elections for the members of the House of Representatives. All federal elections right now. Today, we're going to get back in the swing of that. We're going to get back in our American government swing where we are going to do a 5-minute review. That 5-minute review is going to be based all off the Articles of Confederation bell work that we did last Tuesday, so about a week ago. If you don't remember, it was this sheet of paper that we did, so we're going to go over that. Make sure you have that out. We're going to go over each question and answer there so that you guys can make sure that you got all of those questions right, understand it a little bit better. After that, we are going to get into today's lesson, which is the Miracle at Philadelphia notes. Now, the Miracle at Philadelphia is what has been known as our Constitution that we have today being created. Excuse me. After we had the Articles of Confederation and they did not work, we had this miracle of a brand new Constitution being created in Philadelphia. We're going to talk all about that today and probably a little bit next class, depending on how far we get. So those are the two things you're going to need. I sent you the notes for today's lesson, the Miracle at Philadelphia. Just the other day, they're going to look like this. Mine is 2 pages, but yours might just be all on one Word document. Again, to do those notes, you can either print them out, keep them typed up in your computer, write them down yourself. Doesn't matter, however you've been doing it, that will work today as well. After that, I'll give you the assignment and the attendance question, and we'll be good to go. So without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at those Articles of Confederation questions from last Tuesday. All right, so here is the Articles of Confederation handout that I sent to you guys that you were able to do in one of our previous classes. And I want to go over each of these 11 questions so that you guys understand this a little bit better for our test. So the first question, very simple, it's a vocab word as well. What does the word unicameral mean? Unicameral, uni, obviously means one. You think of words like unicycle, that means one wheel. So uni, whenever you see that, it's always going to mean one. Unicameral means one house or one chamber. And here we're talking about chambers or houses that make laws. So a group of people, basically, when we say a house or a chamber. Number 2 was, did the Articles of Confederation include a plan for the president? And the answer, as many of you found out, was no, it did not. Under our first Constitution, they did not have a plan for a president. There was not a single leader of our country. Number 3, how many delegates or representatives did each state have under the Articles of Confederation? And how many votes did each state have? Well, the answer to both of those questions is 1. So not a lot of people. And also, if you had a larger state, you still had as many votes or representatives as somebody in a smaller state with many less people. Number 4 was a little bit of a tough one. List 5 powers Congress had under the Articles of Confederation. And I'll list a few for you here. The first is that they could make war and peace. A second is they could send and receive ambassadors. A third was that they could enter into treaties. They could raise and equip a navy. They could maintain an army, but this is important. They must request troops from the state to do so, meaning they could only ask states to give them troops for their army. 6th, they could establish post offices, or you could have also put settled disputes between the states. For 5, it says list 7 weaknesses. And this is the main thing that we talked about last class. Remember, the Articles of Confederation were very weak, just like Mr. Finn. Very, very weak. The first weakness was that Congress couldn't collect taxes. And that's how governments pay for everything. Taxes. People give their money via taxes to the government, and that's how the government pays for all the things that it needs. Number 2 was Congress couldn't regulate trade. They had no ability to regulate trade between states and other countries. Congress couldn't enforce anyone to obey the laws either. They could only ask the states, hey, could you guys do me a favor and obey these laws? Could you imagine that today? Not very strong if you don't have a law that is enforceable, where you are only asking people to obey it. Number 4 was that laws had to be approved by 9 of the 13 states. And while this doesn't seem like a weakness at first glance, remember that all of these states were spread out and they had to send representatives all to one meeting spot to approve new laws. A lot of times, only 7 or 8 states would send representatives. So if you only have 7 or 8 states representing or sending representatives, you can't have 9 agree to a new law. So hardly anything ever got done and no laws were ever passed. Number 5, to amend, which is a vocab word, or change the Articles of Confederation, all the states had to agree. Not just 9, not just a majority, but every single one of them. You can imagine how many times that happened. Number 6, as we talked about earlier, there was no executive branch. And we know the executive branch is where we see our president. There was no single leader. And number 7, there was no national court system. So this made it very hard for the government to settle disputes between states. Now, number 7 was a nice little break for you. It was an opinion question. You could have put anything you wanted there. Number 7 was, what were 2 problems that the nation faced after the Revolutionary War had ended? Well, one was that states argued over boundary issues. You had some states saying, this is my land, and the other states would say, no, 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 this is not your land, this is our land. And they had no way to settle that. And number 2, immense debt in the government. The government owed a lot of money, and depression in the country. The economic status of the people was not good. Farmers were losing their farms. People were losing their jobs. Not a lot of people had money, and things were not going well. And that's where we find out about this guy named Daniel Shays. And Daniel Shays was a former captain in the Revolutionary Army. But what he did that was important was he kind of got upset, and he caught beef with all the people that he could in Massachusetts because he was not happy. He was also a farmer, and he led a band, and that means took a group of guys, almost like a mob, and they closed down the Massachusetts Supreme Court. They marched up there. They said, we're sick of this. We're sick of losing our farms, losing our money. All of us who fought in the army, we never got paid. When that didn't work, they gathered 1,200 men, and they advanced on the federal arsenal. The federal arsenal, arsenal, obviously a word where, this is a place where you're keeping weapons and defense items. So this was a huge flashpoint where people started thinking, oh my gosh, this isn't good. The Articles of Confederation is not a good constitution. And the main person who thought that, and there were many, but was this guy, Alexander Hamilton, who we will definitely talk about in the next few classes. But Alexander Hamilton seized Shays' rebellion. And this is the flashpoint for him to say, yo, our Constitution is not good. It is weak, like Mr. Finn. And we need to do something about it immediately. So they go to this thing called the Annapolis Convention. And the Annapolis Convention doesn't do much, except in it, Alexander Hamilton pleads with the delegates and finally persuades them to have another convention. This convention was going to be held in Philadelphia, and there was only one reason for this convention, and that was to revise the Articles of Confederation. Now, if you're looking ahead, you'll see that we have a new constitution, and that all comes in Philadelphia, and that's what we talk about next, our miracle at Philadelphia. But the key point with question 11 is that Nobody expected a new constitution to be formed. The whole point of this Philadelphia Convention was simply to make the Articles of Confederation better. Now, let's move on to our notes today for the miracle at Philadelphia. So, ladies and gentlemen, here we move into our Miracle at Philadelphia notes. And a few things I want to say before we get started. First of all, this is the sheet that I emailed you earlier today. You can do one of three things. You can either print this note sheet out and write in the notes by hand. You can completely copy this note sheet by hand and enter in the notes that we take today by hand as well. Or if you're one of those people who likes to use your computer and has the ability to type into these notes, you may do that as well. Again, we have Cornell Notes, very simple, same thing that we've been doing throughout the year. As long as you get the notes down and are able to take a picture of them, you are good to go for today. Now, a little background about this so-called miracle at Philadelphia. If you recall from our last Articles of Confederation work, we were talking about how once the Articles of Confederation failed, there was this whole new idea to have another convention in Philadelphia, and they did not even have an idea or a desire to create a new constitution. They were simply going there to revise the Articles of Confederation. Once they get to Philadelphia, as you'll see, we get a brand new constitution created, which is a miracle in itself, but also the fact that there were two sides of people that we'll learn about that did not like each other very much, very similar to today. And they were able to come together, put aside their differences, compromise, and create a brand new constitution. So let's start with these notes, at least the first page for today. The first thing I want to talk about is what forms of government existed in the United States before the Constitution was written. Well, most of this should be a review. First of all, we had the Second Continental Congress. And what this was a meeting of delegates from all 13 colonies. If you recall, they all met up to discuss what they should do about the king, King George III, and all the taxes that he was levying upon them. The leader of this Congress, who is often referred to as the real first president of the United States, although that is not true, was John Hancock. And you remember him from signing his name incredibly large on the Declaration of Independence. And as the story goes, he wrote it so large so that King George's fat butt could see it all the way in England. And the most important thing that these guys did in the Second Continental Congress, very simple. They declared independence from Great Britain. So that was the first form of government that we had before our Constitution was written. The next is what we just talked about, the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, as we know, the most important thing about the Articles of Confederation was that it was the first what? The first, I know somebody said it, Constitution. It was the first Constitution, and I could probably spell that word right, of the United States. And one key fact that's a lot different from today is that in that Constitution, there was no president. They did not have a plan for the president in the Articles of Confederation. Also, in this plan, we had a unicameral House, which means one group of people to make laws. And in that, each state, regardless the size or regardless the number of people, each state had only one vote. Finally, the number two thing about the Articles of Confederation, if there's two things I want you to remember about it, one, it was the first Constitution, and second, the Articles were very, yeah, you got it, weak. Just like Mr. Finn. Yeah, that's right. Put that in your notes as well. I'm going to be looking at those notes. You better have weak like Mr. Finn. That was the main idea of the Articles, okay? It was the first Constitution. They were unicameral, so each state only had one vote when it came to passing or making laws. And they were very weak. We knew all about the weaknesses, and we'll discuss them right now. Before we do, let's talk about some of those strengths. One of the major strengths that they had was that they could make war and peace. And they could make they can make peace by accepting into treaties. They could also request troops for an army. Now remember, we don't know if that's necessarily a strength because they still had to request troops. It was completely plausible that the states would tell the government, nah, no thanks. Congress could say, hey, New Jersey, could we have some people to come fight in our army? And New Jersey could say, nah, we good, and not get in any trouble. So they would have a very small army. And then finally, they could send and receive ambassadors. And I believe ambassador is a vocab word. And an ambassador is somebody who represents your country in a nation abroad. Scroll this down a little bit. Now, what could Congress not do? Well, this was huge because Congress was weak, or the articles were weak at least, and they made Congress weak. So Congress could not collect taxes. That's a big one. That was a huge weakness. We also know that they could not force anyone to obey the laws. Spell obey right. They also could not regulate trade. They could not pass laws, or at least not pass laws with ease, because if you recall, 9 of the 13 states had to approve. And many times, not even 9 states would show up. So this was a very, very large weakness. And finally, there was no national court, which meant states would have issues with each other, as they still do today, but there was not a national court to make sure that everything would get settled. So all of these forms of government are what we have before we get our first constitution, the current constitution that we have right now. And that all comes to be known as the Constitutional Convention. And that's where the Constitution that we have today gets created. Now, when did it start? It started in May the 25th of 1787. This is when it started. The more important date is when it ended and when it was ratified. Ratify means to be approved. Where did it happen? As you should know by the title of these notes, it is the Miracle in Philadelphia. And for those of you who don't know, Philadelphia is a city in the state of Pennsylvania. Now, why did it happen? Well, the major reason was to revise the Articles of Confederation. But there were 3 other reasons that helped out. One was that we were obviously having boundary problems between the states. Another was we were having money issues. The country was in debt and farmers were losing a lot of their land. American soldiers had not been paid. So there were many money issues, not just with the government, but also with the people. And then finally, why? Well, the flashpoint we talked about, Shays' Rebellion, where Daniel Shay gets a bunch of men who are fed up and tired of not being paid, losing their farms, to kind of revolt and rebel and make their voices heard. Now, the last part we'll talk about today, and sorry if your notes are getting a little bit different looking than this, but we'll talk about some important people from this Constitutional Convention. The first person, who's probably the most important person of this convention, was known as the father of the Constitution because he took such meticulous notes about what all the people wanted. And his name was James Madison. And you'll hear about him later on as well. The president or chairman of the convention, the person who was put in charge of all of these people, was someone who would turn out to be our first president of the United States once we had this Constitution, George Washington. And finally, two other people that are very important. One we know of, he's on the $100 bill, Benjamin Franklin. He was very helpful. He was very old at this time, but he was very helpful in negotiating between the two sides and making sure that things got done at the convention. And finally, a little known person who I like to include is a man who has a funny first name. Gouverneur, and I even spelled that wrong, that's how funny this is, N-E-U-R, Gouverneur Morris. And he was responsible for creating the preamble to the Constitution, which we will go over, but he was also known as the person who penned the Constitution. These are just some of the important people. There were many people there, and we'll talk about the rest of them and what happens next in our next class. So for today, these are the only notes that you need in our Miracle at Philadelphia Cornell notes. Make sure you have all of this down. We're going to pause right here at who are some important people. It should be the end of your first page, and we will pick it back up here next class. All right, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you understood all those notes. If you didn't, or if you have any questions about the Miracle at Philadelphia notes that we took today, feel free to email me. As always, I will be by my laptop answering all your questions as fast as I possibly can. For today's assignment, very simple. It's everything we just did. We're going to send a picture of today's completed notes to me. Not the notes that I sent you, the ones that you completed with your handwriting, whether it was writing it out, typing it in. Make sure those notes are completed and they are sent to me by midnight tonight. That is your assignment for today. For your attendance question, a little bit different. To make sure that you guys were all paying attention to today's lesson, here's what we are going to do. I want you to answer this question for your attendance question. What event was the flashpoint for Alexander Hamilton saying, yo, we need a new constitution now? This Articles of Confederation stuff is not working. They are not good. They are weak, like Mr. Finn. And they aren't going to get the job done. We need to go have another convention in Philadelphia. What event led to him coming up with that idea? That is your attendance question. As soon as this video ends, email me that answer so that I know you were in class today, and then send me a picture of your notes. If you have any questions, like I said, I'm here to help you out, as always. I hope you guys have a great rest of your Monday. We will see you next class. Take care.